Hello, comrades. Thank you for joining another Mixed Mental Arts chat. We talk about the communism. All right, that's my stupid Russian voice, but thank you, everybody, for joining. We're going to just have a discussion about what is communism exactly. This is not going to be a debate. We're just going to talk about, approach it objectively. This is mostly an informative session. Maybe we'll debate about it later, but we'll keep it as informal as possible. By informal, meant to keep you objectively informed. All right, so let's go ahead and introduce everybody else. I'm Woke Centrist as usual. First on my screen, we have Devendra. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey guys, my name's Devendra. Been a mixed mental artist for a little while. Yeah.
Thank you, comrade. All right, next on my screen, I got Isaiah. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello. I am at once eating and at once joining the chat. So, yeah. Anyway, my name's Isaiah. I have been on here before, and I'm really interested in getting to talk about this because so much of the discourse around leftism or Marxism or whatever the hell we want to talk about regarding the big bad boogeyman that is known as communism is kind of misleading and kind of politically charged in a way to obfuscate real concerns with people. So I think that having a critical look, as objective as possible, at what communism is will help my mind, at least.
All right, awesome. And last but not least, Ed, also known as Sam's Bulldog.
Hi, everybody. It's Edward Kennedy here, also known as Sam's Bulldog. I hope everybody's well. Looking forward to the chat about, as someone just put it, the boogeyman of communism. The curse word, the four-letter word of communism. Looking forward to it, guys. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Now we're going to go ahead and start off. From what I understand, I don't know if Isaiah would agree, is that there's actually a couple different forms of communism. I know there's Marx and Engels, and then there's another form that's based off of anarchy. I don't know if you consider those to be the two that are kind of most talked about, but what do you think about that, Isaiah?
I would say that within the confines of Marxism, there's Marxism and something that preceded it, which was socialism. Socialism's been around since at least the 16th, or not the 16th century, but the since the beginning of the Enlightenment. Basically, it was a ideological conflict in letters between people like John Locke and people like Thomas Hobbes. The eminence of the state to ensure the well-being of people versus the devolution of power to individuals. That's one of the antecedents of it. So that's where, in a lot of ways, the conversation starts. But the conversation really starts even before that in Plato's Republic, where he talks about different ways that different city-states were set up in antiquity and how different communities chose to order their societies. So I don't think that it's necessarily accurate to say that there's two brands of communism, you know, an anarcho-syndicalist idea versus the Marxist-Leninist version of it. But when people think about it today, those are the two that they arrive at. Either the anarcho-syndicalist idea or the strict Marxist-Leninist, you know, dictatorship of the proletariat idea of it. Makes sense?
Right. Yeah. Did you want to break down a little bit of that? I know we're not all as smart as Mr. Gooley.
I'm not smart. I just have no friends and I read a lot.
Well read. You're well read. All right. So what is the? I know about the two little sects. I don't really know about. I know you mentioned anarcho-syndicalist. Like, what is that exactly?
Anarcho-syndicalist is the idea that you were presenting before, like the idea of quote unquote communism, even though it's kind of used in that way, but not really. Of a stateless society where there is basically the core fundamentals of a socialist society where everybody's taken care of and nobody takes more than they need. Without any state controls. Basically, it says that getting rid of the state is the best way for people to start taking care of each other. It's kind of like an offshoot of a like really deep Christian ideals. And then you have the Marxist-Leninist version of communism, which is and I'm saying the Marxist-Leninist version versus strict Marxism because what Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto and in Capital, Das Kapital, are not necessarily congruent with what the Bolsheviks were trying to do in the early 20th century. So the Marxist-Leninist version of communism is what was used in the early Soviet Union before Lenin died, and then it was picked up around the world in other places like Eastern Europe primarily. And it was also picked up to a lesser extent prior to the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a whole other situation altogether. But basically, it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning urban workers are the only people who have can accede to political positions. And with that, basically all property in the state, because the state still exists, is rendered unto the state to be allocated based on I don't want to say technocratic, but that's essentially what it is, technocratic state planning. So when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in October of 1917, right? That was about 8 months after the first Russian Revolution, which replaced the Tsar. And during that period of time, from the end, like the beginning of 1918 until 1921, it was a state of civil war throughout the entirety of former Imperial Russian holdings. And because of this, the first 4 or 5 years of the Soviet Union, they instituted an economic policy known as war communism, in which anything that was produced was, rendered unto the army so that they could wage war to win the war. And that's the first economic history of the Soviet Union is under war communism. Subsequently, before Lenin died, he was trying to institute a new economic policy, which would have included more, not necessarily private ownership, but more devolution of state power to individual Soviets. And another quick nomenclatural note is that the term Soviet refers to like a committee. It's not a demonym for people of the Soviet Union. It refers to like regional or municipal committees. So there was a St. Petersburg Soviet, there was a Moscow Soviet, etc. So yeah, under Marxist-Leninism, there was that beginning of what was supposed to be the new economic policy, and then there's whole other offshoots, and then there's Stalinism, and then there's Trotskyites and all this other stuff. But that was a long-winded explanation to say that the anarcho-syndicalist is kind of like a utopian dream of where, people live in harmony with each other and with nature. and on the flip side is, the statist, technocratic Soviet Union as it was, and the People's Republic of China as it is today.
Yeah, I have a question for you, and I've heard the future societies within Star Trek can be considered communists, and that's due to there being no currency or, I guess, social class within. Um, what do you think about that argument?
Um, I don't know, because it depends on what you mean by communism. Is it in the strict sense of the word? Yes, it would be communism, right? In that it's a fully meritocratic society in which there is no social class and there is no private ownership, ostensibly, of capital, and capital is anything. It's hard money, it's land, it's, as Marx put it, the means of production. So I don't know if Star Trek would be communist per se, maybe more socialist. And here's another note, is that in the Communist Manifesto and Capital, the goal wasn't to all of a sudden institute communism. It was to go on a path from the where they were at the time in Germany and Great Britain, which was, full-fledged capitalism, with, although they still had state monopoly, so it wasn't necessarily, a full true free market capitalism. But to go from capitalism through communism into true socialism, that was the ultimate goal. And there are a lot of problems with the way that Marx did his analysis, especially within the historiographical aspect of his scholarship. And economics is fuzzy in and of itself, but I would say that Star Trek is probably more socialist because it's at the fully developed stage of ostensibly what it's supposed to be. Although technically within socialism there is no need for an army.
True, but yeah, that's true. I guess it's the case in Star Trek where you don't know what you're gonna encounter. So, like, for instance, the Enterprise really isn't a military vessel until it's deemed to be one during a war. But yeah, I see what you mean, especially for how they organize society. So there's a lot of confusion over what communism is amongst lay people. Some people think it's just an economic policy, or it's a way to organize a society. But it seems to me it's both in a way. Would that be a correct insight?
In a way, yes, but also in a way, no. The way that I understand it to be is based within Marxian historiography, right? So Marx was deeply Hegelian in that he looked for structure in the past to extrapolate to the future, right? And Hegel was basically looked at the history of the world and saw that rigid social structures with strong hierarchies were correlated to high prosperity, and inevitably everywhere would end up mirroring Prussia, which is where he did his work, if I remember correct. It was either Prussia or the Holy Roman Empire. I think it was Prussia. But the way that Marx approached it was to refute that while using the same dialectic approach that was presented by Hegel. He essentially laid out that the entirety of history, and written history that is a conflict between between those who own the means of production and those who produce. Basically, between capitalists, people who own the means of production, and the proletariat, the people who actually produce things. So the stages that are proposed by Marx was that feudalism devolves into capitalism, which devolves into communism, a pseudo-authoritarian state, which will eventually erode into socialism. And it's all based within that structure, and it's inevitable in the writings of Marx that will happen. And to put it as what it is, communism is state ownership of the means of production with democracy, is what it's supposed to be under the idea of that was presented by Marx.
All right, so it's means of production, putting it in the hands of, I guess, everyone as opposed to private individuals.
Correct. As opposed to like kings. Like, you got to remember that Marx was he in Prussia? I can't remember. I think he was in like Lower Saxony, but he was in one of those German states before the unification of Russia in 1873, I think it was. So prior to the unification of the German Empire, there were a whole bunch of duchies and kingdoms with basically landed aristocracy, a large bourgeoisie class, which comes from the German Bürger, somebody who lives in a town. The doctors, the lawyers, the craftspeople, non-factory workers in non-industrial towns. Where was I going with this? So, well, can you restate your question, Dusty? Because I kind of derailed myself there. Dustin, where'd you go?
Oh, sorry about that. I was on mute. No, my question was, I guess there's a lot of confusion about basically what communism is just like an economic policy, or it's a social policy, or some people just get confused whether it regards to economics or like what it's does for politics.
I don't think that it's useful to split social programs and economic programs, because society and economy is inextricably linked, right? You can't have a society in the modern world. You can't have a society without an economy, and you can't have an economy without a society.
Yeah, I would say that's correct. But I'm saying, like, in the outer realm, people just get confused about that. That's all I'm saying. Just wanted to see if you could clear it up for some of those people that might be listening.
So it's always both. Like, liberal democracy is an antecedent to the ideas that were put forth by the middle of the century revolutionaries, including Marx. Because you got to remember that in 1848, when the Communist Manifesto came out, there were revolutions all over Europe, and it was based on what, like, the ideas that were presented in the French Revolution. So the Communist Manifesto came directly, almost exactly, from the Declaration of Rights of Man and Declaration of the Rights of Women.
But communism itself
is the idea that there is still a state, and that everything, all the means of production are owned by the state, and the state is of the people, by the people, for the people.
And also, communism is also seen as reactionary to capitalism, right? So,
in a way,
that is the case. Yeah, if that's the case, then what are
More so a reaction to industrialization than capitalism per se.
yeah, I think you're right. Modernization, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, would you want to go over some of Marx's critiques on modernization?
In what respect?
Well, I know that because of the industrialized society, I don't like I said, I haven't read him directly. This is just some videos I've watched, but um, it says that he critiques the way that we compartmentalize our work and that we're no
Oh,
longer connected to it. Yeah,
Specialism.
there you go.
Yeah, so within the context of the industrialization of the economy, Marx had a critique that people will become disillusioned with their work because they are no longer the key producers of their work. Whereas prior to the Industrial Revolution, if you were going to get, a pair of shoes, it would come from a cobbler, and the cobbler would acquire the leather from a butcher or a farmer. He'd acquire the leather, he'd work the leather, probably tan it himself, or he'd, take it to a tanner who he knew, who was in his town. And he would cut the leather, he would shape the leather, he would treat the leather, all in the effort to make a shoe. And he, from start to finish, knew every part of that shoe. And he touched every part of that shoe, and he made every part of that shoe. Whereas under industrialization, you have a guy pulling a lever that punches out the piece of leather that goes into the shoe, and he never sees where it came from or where it's going. And that, to Marx, was a mechanism through which individuals in an industrial economy would become disillusioned with work as a whole.
Well, would you say in that respect that sounds strange, but would you call communism kind of anti-progressive in that respect?
Yes, in that respect, yes. But I think you got to put it in the context of the time. With the Communist Manifesto coming out in 1848 and Capital coming out in 1874? I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was much later than the Communist Manifesto. But that was a time of rapid shift, right? And it wasn't necessarily that Marx was saying, hey, we need to go back to the good old days where, the feudal lord took 50% of our production and, then enslaved us to go to war for his own glory. No, it was more along the lines of, hey, we have all this technology, but the people who are actually doing all the work aren't the people who are profiting from the work. So it called for a massive redistribution of the means of production, not necessarily of wealth per se, but of the ability to profit from production.
So is that part of why a lot of people seem to kind of, and to a certain extent, misinterpret communism, or at least some aspects of communism, and claim that it's anti-capitalist?
It is anti-capitalist.
Well, it is anti-capitalist in those like few respects, but perhaps not in others. And I would say that it is overall. But what would you say it is overall?
Looking at the way that it's presented in history, because that's my strong suit, is looking at history, and the methods that Marx used was to look at, basically write an economic history through the lens of producer and wealth, right? So whereas under certain social structures, I could go and pull a lever 8 hours a day every day, or in Marx's time 12 hours a day or 16 hours a day every day, and get paid a shilling a day to do that. and my kid's working right next to me, and he's, 8 years old. Instead of that, what it draws into contrast with is saying, hey, instead of the money going to the investors, more of the money should be going to the workers. More of the fruits of the labor should be going to the workers, essentially.
So it's like
maybe like perhaps in the context.
In fact, within communism, it's supposed to be all the fruits of the labor are supposed to go to the workers, and there's supposed to be nobody else within that society. There's only workers.
Okay, so that's why within the context of the culture of that period of history, maybe it's an improvement on the government systems that existed at the time, but perhaps in our modern age, it's not as effective as other alternatives. What would you say about that?
I would say that it's too soon to tell, and that Marx didn't see the building of the atomic bomb. So,
great answer.
All right, so we have a question from the chat room. I think I might know it, but Mark Benjamin asks us, what is the difference between communism and socialism? And isn't communism just a subset of socialism?
No.
No?
Well,
okay.
Kind of. All these answers are kind of answers because, again, within the context of, and this is strictly within the context of Marxism, right? The way that Marx outlined things was there was feudalism that transferred into mercantile capitalism, which transitioned into full market capitalism, which would inevitably, because it hadn't happened yet, inevitably transit into authoritarian, basically command capitalism, which is kind of like National Socialism, and transit from that into full socialism through a series of revolutions. That's basically what Marx came along to. However, socialism precedes Marx, and there's not really, I don't know offhand if there was use of the term communism prior to Marx in the way that he used it, but generally speaking, you had the socialist ideal prior to that was essentially portrayed by the Jacobins in that, there is no class. It's an abolition of social class. It's an abolition of ownership, all ownership, not just state ownership, not just in private ownership, but it's an abolition of all ownership, essentially, into where anybody can get anything they need from the community in which they're living. And yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like anarchy, right? If there's no ownership.
Yeah, that's the idea of anarcho-syndicalism, which is the full-blown socialist utopia idea.
What's the difference between anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-capitalism? Are they like opposites in some sense?
Anarcho-capitalism is a weird thing. It's basically the religion of the free market.
Yeah, it kind of is.
I don't see any anarcho-capitalism hasn't been around all that long, but it's kind of like a diffuse cluster of like
when I mentioned it to my history teacher in my class last year, he didn't know what it is. That's how
because it's a completely new thing with a lack of a coherent message. It's like the way that anarcho-capitalism is presented is get rid of all state get rid of the state completely, get rid of all laws, and have still have private property. and people will figure it out. It's basically saying that. And that there will still be private property and nobody's going to come and steal it from you because of the non-aggression principle.
And that somehow people are going to all adhere to that non-aggression principle. Which
exactly.
Which is a massive fantasy. Or alternatively, you're going to have private militias to defend your property. A series of competing private militias. I wonder how that will turn out.
Kind of like it did in Europe in the Middle Ages.
That was also a problem too. In the New York draft riots, there were like 2 different police departments who fucked each other up in the streets instead of fighting crime.
Yeah, or you can just look at what's happening in Libya, where you have a series of competing militias who have differing spheres of influence. They compete. This is also known as gangs. That's what private militias are. They compete for territory. They compete for, because protection. And I mean, I think this is where the anarcho-capitalists, sort of have value is that, they call the state a mafia and that tax is a protection racket. And they're absolutely correct. That's what the state is. But the point is that, you're far better off living in a system where there's one godfather, and having that godfather being a rotating individual who is elected by the mass of the people, and where there are systems of transparency and accountability and checks on his power, rather than, just having a godfather emerge who is able to, most effectively use violence.
I also get what they mean. In our most utopian version of government, which is, what reading Lessig would kind of get you in the notion of, is that every citizen has their equal representation in a government. And, of course, that's not the case now, but in an anarcho-capitalist society, there's no way really to get equal representation. You're only represented by how much money you have. So if you're able to pay for certain things, that's your representation. But if you wanted to be represented in one area but couldn't afford it, then you're outside of the system no matter what.
Well, and I think the other important thing about, anarcho-capitalism and where they have a lot in common with communism is that for them to believe in their ideology, they have to exclude all disconfirmatory evidence, right? Like if you talk to an anarcho-capitalist and you start talking about, hey, what about Somalia? Isn't that an example of what you're talking about? Or why not Libya? They start saying, no, that wouldn't count. Like, do you really think America is Somalia? Like, we're different. And so they start having to create this exceptionalism until we're looking at a system that has this big feature called government, but that somehow we're going to get the results by removing government. And the communists do the same thing. Like if you talk to a modern day communist, they will always tell you that, no, Soviet Union, Mao's China, these weren't true communism. And true communism has never been tried.
Invisible hand.
Exactly.
No truth.
I think the problem is that you're never going to be able to achieve these true theoretical constructs, no matter what.
Utopias. Like, admittedly, in the writing of any socialist utopianite, let's go with utopianite. I like that. In any writing of a utopianite, you get, these constructions of societies that are so perfect, it's like they're not human. So they take the human out of society. And that was that's the shortfall of all the early 20th century and late 19th century, thinkers and revolutionaries, really, is that they tried to institute societies that weren't built for people.
Yeah, and like having a utopia isn't even a good idea because you would just
we can talk about that later.
And you would hate
the idea of a utopia.
a utopia where you never had any challenges.
Well, we could talk about that idea later, but because that's a completely other thing. I just read a book called Utopia for Realists, which is really interesting, and it kind of is a refutation to what you said in a lot of ways. But let's look at what.
Can you hear me?
Hi. Okay,
Hey,
so
Mark.
so we have a confluence
Yeah,
of people.
funny.
Hunter. Hi, Hunter. Who are you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Hunter. I co-host the Brian Callen Show, formerly Mixed Mental Arts, formerly the Brian Callen Show.
Formerly Man
Uh,
Thoughts.
Formerly Man Thoughts. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. The other thing that I also wanted to say is that Ed threw in a really good thing, no true Scotsman, the no true Scotsman fallacy. Ed, do you want to explain what that is?
Well, let's introduce Mark first.
Yeah, and then introduce
Hey.
Mark and then talk about the no true Scotsman.
Hi, Mark. Who are you?
Oh, hi,
I'm
Mark.
Hey, I'm Mark Benjamin, just a guy that decided to join the chat and to sum me up, a very curious individual and poor like an American adult that actually I will defend capitalism, but I do like the regulated bits. And you know, a separation between like a clear separation between what the state does and what commerce do.
Okay.
Or I guess that does. So
Okay.
kind of socialism.
Mark, you missed the beginning of the chat where we outlined that we're really only going to talk about the ideas of communism in the abstract and not devolve into necessarily which system's
I actually
better.
really like to hear that.
Yeah. Just an explication of explication of what communism is. And now Ed, tell us about No True Scotsman.
Well, I'm not an expert, but my understanding of the no true Scotsman fallacy is an attempt by one side of a debate to deflect specific criticism by arguing that specific criticism doesn't apply to the argument. In other words, not accepting the example I would give is, well, Christians who call each other not Christian, right? You know, Christians love to say that Mormons aren't Christian. Well, those aren't real Christians. So if they were real Christians, they'd be acting like this, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's an advanced
not own criticism.
It's an advanced form of goalpost moving. It's saying, hey, you know, basically the reason why it's called No True Scotsman is because you have a person who says, oh, all Scotsmen wear kilts. And then the person who's arguing with that individual says, hey, but there's a Scotsman over there wearing pants. And then he's not a true Scotsman because he's not wearing a kilt. So it's a advanced form of goalpost moving.
So with regards to our current conversation, it's like saying that socialism or communism has never been tried, or that, you know, Libya is not an example of anarcho-capitalism.
In a way, yes. In a way, yes. Explicitly, I don't know.
Yeah, or to say, you know, ISIS are not Muslim because true Muslims would never behave like that. You basically just take anybody that, you know, you don't want on your team and remove them from your team. And, you know, or, oh, eugenicists were not scientists because if they were real scientists, they would have blah, 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 blah. And so what ends up happening is that
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Ed?
Well, inevitably, it's a way to not own legit criticism.
Yeah, and basically what ends up happening is that in any intergroup conflict with humans, what happens is that if you're trying to, for example, attack science, then you put eugenics in the bucket of scientists. Hey, you guys have to own this shit. And if you're trying to defend science, you're like, oh, that shit, that's not in our bucket. We're going to move that outside and say they're not real scientists. And it's basically like,
no,
you know,
scientists have to own eugenics for sure.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but
I see perfect in corollary to those that say, well, you know, communism hasn't been tried, so we don't know yet. There's something like 5 current communist countries, and China, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. And there have been many in the past, which I won't read right now. But of course it has been tried. It's been tried a lot.
Yeah, you can like history definitely shows the errors of communism, right? But like one of the ways that my mind has personally changed slightly lately is that this doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas of communism are inherently evil, even though they're probably not that effective, in my opinion.
And to go off what we were talking about earlier, like the problem with utopian ideas is that they're not built for people. The failure of communism wasn't a failure of communism. It was the failure of the people who tried to institute it, because they fell prey to the same, cognitive biases, naive realism, et cetera, ad infinitum, that all humans fall prey to. That's why you get eugenicists, and that's why you get Stalinists.
Also, the problem is that the human behavior side of corruption is like these specific sects on the very far ends of our spectrum that hinge on anarchy. They cannot thrive without the slightest bit of corruption. So if there is even just a small, slight bit of corruption, um, these 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 systems that are close to anarchy are very hard to sustain because of that simple human behavior.
The argument of anarchists, though, with regards to that, would be that the government has institutionalized that very same problem, and it's actually worse than it would be if there wasn't an institution that made it possible.
Yeah, I think the problem is that you do need some mechanism for enforcement and for conflict resolution. Like the question is who, and I think so. The what I have heard, because I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of anarcho-capitalists, is that the problem is that the government has a monopoly on violence, and that's not a bug, that's a feature. Because when you don't have a group of people with a monopoly on legitimate violence, you have a competition of violence, which is what ends up happening in places like Libya, where there isn't a single legitimate government. And you have everybody vying to try and make themselves the legitimate government. So the point is that you want a monopoly on legitimate violence so that the competition for power is to control that. And that we're thereby trying to minimize violence. Does that make sense?
Sure, but I guess my question then is, what the monopoly on violence, what purpose does it serve? Like for instance, I think a lot of anarchists believe that there's less of a need for violence without that type of institution. I mean, as it is now, I mean, like you said, there is a monopoly on the violence, but if there wasn't a government that was at war in the Middle East, would any of us be at war in the Middle East? Right.
Well,
and I think an anarcho-capitalist also might say that it's better for the free market to control the monopoly on violence than the government to control it.
Yeah, but what that means is that if the free market is controlling it, then you have a free market of violence. You have a competition of violence. Like that's what that means.
But I think what you really have is a competition of self-defense. And
what's the functional difference between self-defense and violence?
Well, one only occurs when it's been provoked, and the other one occurs whenever violence happens. Period.
And what's a provocation?
Violence without first being violence.
So
the first person to act violently would be the provocator.
Exactly. So what's to stop me from being a provocateur in the situation where there's no mechanism necessarily to stop me from doing so?
And also, if
There
we
is a
look at
mechanism, it's just privately owned. And the people who run the privately owned mechanisms have to compete for your money in order to survive. And
It's a game of who
there's
has the
one
biggest
group
gun.
if there's a
Maybe maybe
don't
like
need to
a
make a
current
gun
an example in
support.
like the current landscape of this might be like the people who own and control the social media companies like Twitter and Facebook control a lot of the population's like interpretations of news events and stuff like that, right? So that's like not controlled by the government, is what I'm saying.
But it's still a form of control, and you have the option to go to a different social media network if you do not like the way, say, Facebook is running its algorithms. However,
Yeah,
when you
but they
when
like
you have
have
a regulatory
sorry.
group that is telling you that you have to do this, that, and the other in order to be able to compete, then what you have is a monopoly by Facebook because the government has instituted regulations that make it next to impossible for smaller versions to arise and compete.
Like Google.
But Devendra, let's play this out. And yeah, I mean, I think Isaiah's right. Like, we could definitely talk about anarcho-capitalism at a different time. This is a communism chat. But what I would say is that the other theme that is worth noting here is that anarcho-capitalists have decided that the problematic institution is government and want to throw that out. And then communists decided the problematic institution was the free market and want to throw that out. And, you know, I mean, I think that there's a competing set of systems and solutions that we need in order to be effective. But what has never effectively been answered for me by any anarcho-capitalists, and why I won't be signing up for it anytime soon, is, okay, you have your private militia, I have my private militia. What's to stop you from just having the bigger gun, as Isaiah says, and just stealing all my fucking property? Or me deciding I have the bigger gun, and because I feel like you're starting to show signs that you might do that, that I have to defend myself by proactively taking all your shit.
That's
There's
why
also
there's
more
no such
practical
thing as a
I've never
perfect
that.
political system, and regardless of who controls the monopoly on violence, it's not necessarily superior to anyone else controlling the monopoly on violence.
I think that
There's also resources as well.
you guys talk about the non-aggression principle being silly and whatnot, but essentially, like, you still have rules, and when those rules are violated, you have an entire community that upholds the rule, right? And so if we suddenly remove the government as like our protection, are you gonna go around and start stealing from everybody?
Now you sound
No.
like a
But
communist.
if someone does, then the rest of the community then is justified in removing them from the community.
Well, in the same way,
And if you come up with your own violent monopoly and create a community where everybody steals from each other, then you've got your own community where you're allowed to do that, but nobody will live in it.
yeah, but that's why the communists did things like build walls so people couldn't leave their community. I mean, you know, and the other thing too is, on top of that, you know, there was a stated principle, all sorts of great fine principles in communism of equality, and that, you know, where everything is going to be owned by the workers and all of that sort of stuff. Now, in spite of that, the system became massively unequal, and there was a nomenclatura, at least in Russia, that had all sorts of special privileges. They had special hospitals, special cars, drivers, dachas, special food. You know, I mean, Stalin like had a pretty good life. Like, communism was pretty good for Stalin, just wasn't very good for anybody else, in spite of these clearly stated philosophical principles. It ended up being pretty shitty for most people. And that's what tends to happen with human systems, is that there's a nice principle, but is it actually lived, and is it actually practiced or not?
So I mean,
Only to
that
count for
points
bad
the finger at the
players.
institutions.
So
don't-
again, I'm gonna mention again that we're not trying to
No, and
debate
yeah.
anarcho-capitalism.
Oh
And
no, I'm talking about communism.
I didn't bring it up.
It's best to within that frame in the framework of communism. It's best to think of okay, what are the bad players that's gonna crop up outside of the state or inside of the state, and how will they mess with the system that, or what's called that it is going to be formed, because communism needs to be kind of built up like any other system from the ground up, and then there's also the social engineering, and then you need to take into account the bad players up top, in other words, the people that are running things on the bottom and in the middle, and kind of and basically that dance in between. But like I said, I'm here to learn about it more so than comment, more because I really am interested in this in this subject, because I've been looking at the small L libertarian N stuff through, but I still haven't got through the communist version of finance. So this is and the concept itself in detail, and I like to map that out nicely.
Well, to that point, I think that there's a lot of scholarship that's been written about different economic structures and how they work, and the weak point of any economic structure is its models, because what's the quote? There's all kinds of models and they're all wrong, but some of them are useful. So
yeah, it's kind of like a map. Hey guys, it's kind of like a map. Like a map is not accurate. It's not really what's there, but it'll get you where you need to go. And I think this is something that we need to consider as well. Is let's do the assumption. I've heard something like 3% of the population are bad actors. So they're not nearly as good of actors as Brian Callen was in The Hangover, but they're people who are intentionally bad, intentionally will misuse the system. So how do we, 3% is big. And so how do we, adjust? How do we live with that 3% and kind of either, make sure that they don't have an effect, or kind of like push them away and make sure that that 3% doesn't, cycle all the way up to murder and, pillaging and raping, everything like this?
I think the bad actor quotient might be plus or minus 2.5 to 2.9%. Because I doubt that there are 3% bad actors in any given society.
Well, this is the parts where people are in every society. There are people that get screwed, and then there's the people that want to climb up the hierarchy, regardless of that not nifty moral thing. And then there's, like I said, the people that just want to burn everything up. And of course, there are not a lot of people, but there is a nice chunk of them, and they tend to be nice and charismatic enough to get up into some remnants of power, and the people that get screwed over and are bad actors through that gateway. Let's just not have any Venezuela. And that's the only thing I got to say for that.
I think one of the problems too, like if you take a look into it, is that Marxism was trying to eliminate class structure, and a lot of that was about making everybody a worker. But the problem with that is modernization almost requires bureaucracy, and once you create a bureaucracy, you're creating a hierarchy that's different from a worker class. I know a lot of the critique was, there's this class that's not working, but they're reaping profit. So in any type of situation where there's a hierarchy and those who are not participating in the economic engine as such as an exploitative worker, anytime that is outside of the theoretical construct that communism tries to build, you're just not going to get what you want. And that's what I saw with these communist countries.
Well, it's also the problem is decision making. So, somebody ultimately has to make the decisions of what is allocated and how it's allocated. So, resource allocation. And the free market does that with competition for resources. So that, at least hopefully or theoretically, you're allocating resources to people who will use them best. The communist systems generally just allocated those resources to the state and then made the state in charge of it. The problem is, and this is where you get into the on-the-ground realities, is that the Soviets, who I know much less about the Chinese system or what happened in Cambodia or Cuba, but the Soviets would come up with these 5-year plans, and they would set very specific criteria. The problem is that inevitably people would game the system. So you would say, for example, you will be paid for producing this many feet of steel. So, of course, what they would do to meet that quota is press the steel super thin so that it would stretch out as long as possible. And then they would change it to be based on thickness. And then you would get these super thick plates that were totally unusable. So the reality is that however you design the rules of the game, people will basically try and game the system. So, the hope is to have a system that is dynamic and actually responsible to the needs and desires of the people.
Yeah, and that works for capitalism too. If you think about any of trading futures like commodities and securities, those are just gambles on theoretical outcomes that might occur. So this is money being made off of no commodity actually in place. It's just playing with people's money to profit a certain person at a certain time, which has nothing to do with the actual outcome of a product.
Well, and also to your point, Dusty, that also determines where people then choose to go. Like the number of people who want to go into finance on Wall Street is huge because in this society, that's where the greatest gains can be had. There's just not that much competition for teaching positions. And is that really a good allocation of labor and talent, or is that ultimately destructive to the future of the society?
Yeah, and I think
to our kids. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to say sorry. By the way, Mark, your audio levels are pretty low, so maybe put your mic closer to your mouth or something. I don't know.
Can you hear me now?
It's still
No, you can't hear you. I think it's your microphone in general, because you're outside walking, and I don't know what your equipment
Okay, I'm
looks
going
like.
back in then.
Last week
Yeah,
though,
it's
it was pretty good. Last week it was okay. Last week was even too much, like with cars going by and everything like this. But yeah, I was gonna say like capitalism has the advantage over socialism or communism is that people are trying to game the system, but people are spending like their whole lives, their whole careers, and hundreds of people are spending their whole careers trying to figure out how to game the system. And as Hunter said in this pressing sheet or sheet metal example, like the people who are doing it, the people who are on one side of trying to game the system, they'll figure it out versus a bureaucrat who spent like 20 minutes being like, okay, let's make, this many square feet. And so it's kind of more of a balanced fight, I guess, versus, in the communism, it's like the bureaucrats, they don't care. They're going to spend like 20 minutes thinking about, whatever their policies are. And so that's why you get weird stuff like that. Isaiah, you're raising your hand. Is that?
Yes, I'm raising my hand. I have a question for your assertion there. What is the functional difference between a state bureaucrat and, say, I don't know, a investment banker?
One has skin in the game, maybe.
Not anymore.
Do they?
Well, when the government protects the rights of the banks and bails them out and whatnot, your investment banker has less incentive to do it properly and has more of an incentive to game the system.
Perhaps, but at the same time, what skin does the investment banker have in the game, even if he doesn't get bailed out?
Well, he has to make a profit. So if he doesn't, then he loses his house.
He has to stay liquid. He doesn't necessarily have to make a profit.
Okay.
Those are two competing because
sure. No, that's fine.
Because as is said, is that the business of business is business. It's not to produce anything. It's to keep the business open. So if you're liquid, then you still are in business, regardless of how big your losses are. I mean, look at Amazon, which still posts, billion-dollar deficits in their profit loss margins every year. And Tesla, same thing. Like every Tesla vehicle that is sold at a loss. So in this capitalist system in which we live, what is the functional difference between the investor class and the nomenclatura?
Yeah, I think the problem,
I think I got
if we're,
that.
if we're going back to 2008 crisis, Isaiah's completely right about liquidity. Because if you think about it, in order to get the assets that they needed, they had to take people's homes away, which weren't very liquid at the time. So, business stopped. So I think Isaiah's right in that regard.
I think they stopped having skin in the game when they untethered. And this is what I literally just started learning this, so there's going to be a lot of holes. But when they untethered gold or commodities from the dollar, I think what I learned recently is basically banksters put a bunch of laws in there that protects them from from any losses they have by using the public's money, and kind of just making it so they're more integral to the public, like stability.
So
and kind of added that over time. And so if they don't bail a bank out, especially if it's a super bank, then everyone's screwed. They kind of put themselves in that position.
To that note, Mark, to that note,
but
I would suggest that everybody here,
lots of holes though. Yeah.
you're still really quiet, Mark. You gotta fix your volume or something.
Yeah.
But to that point,
I'll see if I can fix it on the control panel.
To that point, as mentioned before, I think that everybody would be served to look up Mark Blythe and what he has to say about the economic history of especially the stock market crash, and how too big to fail and too big to bail and monetary crises are kind of built into the capitalistic system.
All right, there we go.
And that was there you go. And that was something that was addressed in the early economic writings, first of Walter Baggett with the book called Lombard Street, talking about I think it was the financial panic of like 1878 or something. And then later on with John Maynard Keynes talking about that specific talking about the Great Depression. And a note about the Great Depression is that even though there was a tremendous drop in the stock market and unemployment shot up to 25% in a lot of places, it wasn't a situation in which the rich lost all their money at all. I mean, sure, a lot of people who had investments lost a lot of money, but at the same time, the people who were hardest hit were the poor working classes and the lower middle class of professionals who served the lower middle class. The upper class did fine during the Great Depression. And the investment bankers, the college professors, the lawyers, they did fine during the Great Depression. Standard Oil did fine. So are they really protected against, failures of the economic system in the same way? Was the nomenclatura or the bureaucrats in China, were they protected against the failures of those economies, like during the Great Chinese Famine? Not really.
But who's doing the protection?
Like
Passive
giving
voice.
information?
Sorry. It was a passive voice, so it's not explicitly saying that somebody's protecting somebody.
But
it's a figure of speech.
What kept the rich from being affected?
They had greater liquidity. So they were able to purchase goods and services and maintain their wealth because they had enough wealth to do so.
Okay.
Yeah, they also had the power of the state.
Also that.
That's
I mean,
And they also knew a guy. that knew what was happening before
Protected
everyone
by the
else.
state. The rich are protected by the state.
Yes,
but
the rich
the
are.
as was
Yeah.
the nomenclatura,
So
right?
it's not.
I mean, I think
It's not capitalism. It's the state that's protecting the ultra rich.
Yeah.
And it's the rules that the state implements that allow the rich to not pay taxes and
I
put
think
their
that's
money in other places. So
is that
so
a distinction without a difference? Because what you're looking at is that that government is always corrupt is the argument that you're making, and that the way that it's set up is inevitably going to lead to a situation in which the government is in complete control and favors only a few over the many, and that the market doesn't do that. What I would offer in refutation to that is that there is no such thing as a society, big or small, that doesn't have some sort of rules and regulation. And those rules and regulations at the scale of the nation state are what we call government.
Mm-hmm.
So could you have the same rules but decentralized to the point of communities? Like
that's what the majority of human history was. Until the Peace of Westphalia in the 1640s, that's what the entirety of human existence was. Like you had feudal lords and whatnot, but most people were out of sight and out of mind of the feudal lords.
And then what did those feudal lords do, Isaiah? Did they peacefully coexist around the non-aggression principle?
No, they killed each other, but and
like adults.
And in the burgs, in the small towns, they acted a little bit more economically efficiently because it was so small. Like very rarely in medieval Europe and other places around the world did you have a community that was greater than 150 to 250 people. So everybody knew each other. So the mechanisms that govern society weren't legislative, they were customary. That's the difference between a customary law and a written law, is that any rule that a person follows can be construed as being a law. And the distinction between a state and a community is razor thin. That's based on the amount of people. So when you're making an argument that it's the state that, made the situation as it was, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg in this situation? How do you get a state without mercantilism, which preceded capitalism? How do you have capitalism without a state? There's tons of economic literature that would argue that you can't have either without the two.
And also, if you are going to have decentralized, but if you're going to have, I mean, again, like this is where I think Joe Henrich's work becomes super important, which is that in order to have the benefits of modernity, you need large hive minds. Like if you collapse down to a series of units of 150, then you end up being like the Tasmanians and you no longer get the economies of scale. So once you start to centralize, you start to get all sorts of efficiencies where, great, it makes sense to have a factory that employs thousands of people focused only on making a standardized screw, because there are the national level governance and trust mechanisms in order to be able to transport, and have that large of a market. I don't think that if you go back to essentially the feudal system of Europe or something like that is decentralized, that how do you ensure those continued trust mechanisms? What do you do if you're a series of towns of 150 and one town decides, you know what, instead of making shit and trading shit, we're just going to like gobble up everybody else's territory and set ourselves up as the superclass and everybody else will be our helots?
You mean what happened throughout human history since the dawn of agriculture? I mean, I think people forget that humans have been around for a while, and that anything that you can imagine a society being structured as has been tried in a lot of places. So it becomes a situation where if we're talking about our own utopia, you take what works in one society and get rid of what doesn't work in your society. And then you slowly build to something that works in the long run, hypothetically
was-
speaking, if you're going to build a utopia.
I absolutely agree. I mean, just let's go with what's practical. Leave the theories behind. You know, anarcho-capitalism works, it doesn't. Well, can we show that it has worked in the past? Communism works or it doesn't. Can we show that it has worked in the past? And maybe people in similar situations, societies in similar situations, or whatever. Let's just go with what works, and let's just do it, and let's just experiment. Let's have 1,000 different experiments going at one time, and the one that works best, let's be like, okay. Well, the 50% that obviously did not work, let's bail on that, and then eventually, circle in on the right one.
Yeah, and
That's
there's
exactly
like
what
new
libertarians
tech
want to
and
do.
oh, sorry. There's new factors now compared to before as well. Like last week, we were talking about crypto. How is that going to affect communism? Will it actually enhance maybe socialism? And or will it just make anarcho-capitalism a thing? Or metals, or like first you need to think about the money source, then the land resources and all that other stuff, and how you distribute them, and also how to encourage innovation as well within like I'll have to assume that communism is in a closed system in a way. This is an assumption. I'm gonna that's a question. But
Okay, so to get back
yeah.
onto the education
Sam,
portion
interesting.
of the chat,
Yeah.
because I mean the whole impetus behind me wanting to talk about this in the first place is that I feel people don't understand what they're arguing for or against when it comes to communism, or when it comes to socialism, or when it comes to the nation state, because most people don't seem to have read history. And if just grab 5 to 10 history books, spend 6 months and read some history, or watch a whole bunch of documentaries. And I mean, there's Yale open coursework on YouTube that you could just pull up and basically study any aspect of history that you want to study. And within the context of what communism is, it's explicitly a reading of history. At Marxist communism is a reading of history between the people who own the means of production and those who produce. Basically, it's history through the eyes of the means of production, and the means of production include anything that people use to live. So it's land, it's water, and in the industrial age in which these social ideas, not just communism but also socialism, came about, it's also logistics, roads, ships, etc., and it's energy, and it's industrial products like clothes, shoes, consumer products. So that's
Okay.
the whole
Well, I'm a
idea.
work in progress. So yeah.
Well, the whole idea behind what Marx was saying is that any society that he's looked at in 1870, in the 1870s, where when he wrote Capital, was to look at the history of capital and look at the histories of societies in transitioning from basically single ownership of capital, which was the feudal or imperial systems, where a monarch or a sovereign owned all within his domain, and everything belonged to him, and anything under him was just a transfer of his own belongings to people whom he also owned. Everybody in a kingdom is owned by the king. That's one aspect that you have to look at. So the king owns all the means of production. And
All right.
and then you had a transfer once the age of discovery began from that type of sovereign ownership into mercantile capitalism, where the sovereign would give monopolies over trading companies, essentially like the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, to basically bring in raw materials from abroad, fashion them into finished materials in their country, and then resell them abroad in order to increase the gold stores, the specie, that's the hard metals of gold or silver in that country. So that was the second phase of Marxist history, right? From feudalism, where the sovereign owns everything, to mercantile capitalism, where the monarch still owns everything, but it's being there's a greater devolution of power on trade of stuff that's still ostensibly owned by the sovereign. From there, you had a series of revolutions where the people, the capitalists, proto-capitalists, who were the merchants, basically went to the sovereign and said, hey, since we're doing all this work, we own this shit now. You don't have a choice. And that was the Glorious Revolution. That was, a lot of the revolutions in Italy. That's the stuff that, Machiavelli wrote about, is how does a prince maintain his power in this system where the merchants actually have more functional power than the sovereign, the nobility. So that's the next stage, where it transitions from a command mercantilism to a market mercantilism. And then you have the Industrial Revolution, where people are decentralized from the means of production to where people are making widgets in a factory and they have no control over their bodies, and somebody else owns all the land still. And that's the milieu that Marx was writing in when he proposed his natural transition from a feudal state to inevitably, in his mind, a socialist state. It's basically the same utopian vision that the founding fathers had, taken under the milieu of European feudalism. It's like they're the same incubating ideas, but grown up in two different environments.
But in both
thanks for
cases,
that.
there's an inevitability of a historical dialectic process.
Yes.
The central tenet of Marxism, which is that essentially there's this conversation that's being had back and forth between all these different elements, and that inevitably that conversation will win out in a particular direction. This is also very much Fukuyama's the end of history and the last man. So there are a lot of these visions that people are trying to figure out. What is it that history wants? Where is it going? And if we can figure out where we think it's going, then we can just make that happen faster. And that was very much what the communists tried to do. They were atheists, but they believed that they had history on their side, which the difference between having God, a man upstairs, and a large abstract thing that controls everything, and history, a large abstract thing that controls everything. I'm not quite sure what the difference is there, but that was essentially what happened. Yeah.
Side note, thanks for breaking that down for us and for me, most certainly. Got your name, but yeah, thanks for breaking that down. The history of the means of production and where those stuff comes from, because I thought I needed special attention towards it, because I tend to jump around a lot when doing research between many different projects. And I thought it was something I needed special attention to, the same thing as what I'm doing with the banking system right now. So thanks for that. That was actually a very nice, there's a very good, and you too, I'll call you teacher guy.
Yeah.
Oh,
I have a question about a Marxist critique that's a little controversial. I'm not super well read on communism, but there was this notion that profit is theft, not unlike taxation is theft.
Yeah. That is a I don't remember where that specific idea comes from, but a lot of that was bandied about during one of the early purges under Stalin, where Stalin, sent people to the gulag and killed the kulaks for profiting off of being middlemen in the.
Can we talk about the kulaks?
Yes, let's talk about the kulaks.
So essentially, it wasn't, I think the first thing to realize is that especially Soviet communism, it wasn't a singular commitment to communism. So there were the early years of Lenin where they were super hardcore about the communist ideology. And then it became clear that the system wasn't working. They weren't able to supply what people needed. And so then they instituted the NEP, or the New Economic Plan. And they basically dialed back the whole communism thing. They started to have some market reforms, and suddenly they were able to better provide for people. Then, Lenin died, and Stalin got rid of all of his rivals and consolidated power. And Stalin engaged in forced collectivization, where rather than having small farmers own their property, they basically, confiscated all that land and put it into massive collective farms. Now, what the Soviets were very good at was identifying groups who were their enemies to basically galvanize the people into action. So obviously, in the early days, it was the aristocracy and the White Russians who were allied with the aristocracy. But by the time of Stalin, they'd already killed those people off or driven them out. So they needed to find a new enemy, who were the kulaks. And the kulaks were the peasants who were slightly wealthier than the other peasants. So they basically started doing everything they can to say that kulaks were the class enemy now. Kulaks needed to be killed. Kulaks' property needed to be confiscated. And they basically empowered the poorest members of the village communities to go out and persecute the kulaks and confiscate all their property. And any sort of, especially under Stalin, they basically established this idea of wrecking, and that any sort of profit making of any kind was basically destroying the Soviet economy. And so this became their reflective, yeah, exactly. Andrew said it best, tribalism, that like, oh, why wasn't the Soviet system working? Oh, it was because of wreckers. It was because these people who were profiteering. And always the black market was blamed for the problems of the society, even though the black market was probably a huge part of what kept the Soviet system working for as long as it did. But yeah. Death to the kulaks.
Death to the kulaks. And that was the same phenomenon that occurred during the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution basically started after the Great Chinese Famine, right? So you had the first 5-year plan in the People's Republic of China was basically identical to the first 5-year plan under Joseph Stalin in 1931. Or was it 29 or 31, Hunter?
I thought it was 29 to 34, but
yeah, it was 29. But yes, so the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union was instituted, and then a whole bunch of Ukrainians died in what's known as the Holodomor, because of the forced collectivization and the drop in production and the export of grain to other places to basically build up the army is what they were doing. So the
and just to give a to give a little bit of context on how bad the Holodomor was. Holod means hunger in Ukrainian, but it was so bad that parents used to have to warn their children not to go outside because cannibals were roaming the countryside. And in Bloodlands, Tim Snyder tells a story of a woman who, as she's desperately trying to survive, makes her children promise her that if they die, they will eat her. And then the next morning they came down and found that she had killed herself. She had literally sacrificed her own life so that her children would have something to eat. And there are these gnarly photos from the Holodomor of humans literally selling human flesh in the market, like old couples with like just legs, arms, various things, and they're selling that. So, this is what that forced collectivization that Stalin did, and it was between 1928 and 1932 led to. Anyway, Isaiah?
Yes. Basically the same thing happened in the People's Republic of China after the first 5-year plan there. Some 20 million people starved to death in China because it was twofold, right? So the forced collectivization, I think it was 53 when the first 5-year plan was instituted. And basically the CCP set up economic goals that they wanted to hit, including collectivization, right? So they wanted to increase steel production X%, and they wanted to increase grain production. Yeah, 53 to 57. And then Mao was ousted from the chairmanship in 58. So they wanted to increase steel production, and they wanted to increase agricultural production, right? So they started using tons of chemical fertilizers. They basically got rid of the old wet rice system in the South and instituted more deforestation and wheat planting in the South. And in the North, they basically got rid of the, they basically dug up the prairies that were in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia and planted a ton of wheat there. And at the same time, basically, they encouraged all these collectives to at the same time produce steel. So this is where you get these images of backyard furnaces where people would be taking cooking pots and knives and heirlooms and throwing them all together to make Chinesium. Basically, you can't even really call it steel or iron. And that lasted for 5 years.
Chinesium.
Chinesium.
Is it better than adamantium?
It might be worse than tin.
But it turned out that Chinesium was unobtainium, because no matter how hard they tried, they just couldn't make good Chinesium.
Yep.
I turned that movie off the second time they said that word.
Unobtainium.
I've never seen that movie because of that word.
So stupid. But anyway, the agricultural season in 1958, there was a drought, so they weren't able to. The harvest was basically dead, and they couldn't do shit. And from 58 to 62, probably about estimates are between 2 and 12 million people died from the Great Famine. And almost immediately after, well, not immediately after, but soon after, there were people in the government, in the CCP, who were trying to institute more quote unquote liberal policies, less collectivization, more individual incentivization of labor, more greater returns to the peasants. And after that, after those people started getting rich, they instituted the Cultural Revolution, which was essentially the same as the Kill All Kulaks movement.
Which is always a good idea. Fewer kulaks, because what you end up doing is, of course, the kulaks were the few people in the village who actually knew how to do agriculture most efficiently. So, yes, they're your ideological enemies, but they're also your technical experts. And this is where often what ends up happening, it's the same thing that happened with the debathification or any of these movements to remove the bureaucracy. These people may have been part of an evil system, but they are the ones with the technical skills to do things. The other thing as well that the Chinese did was to force doctors to be farmers. Which is a fucking brilliant allocation of your talent and resources.
Not only that, they got rid of any requirements to attend a university.
Now, along those lines, I actually just an article was shared with me that apparently there was a decision that air traffic control it didn't have enough diversity in it, and so there was a program to basically make it so that you would take some sort of test beforehand, and if you had not been employed in the last 3 years and had no science background, then you would be fast-tracked into air traffic control. So choosing people who are deliberately unqualified for a job because you have some social intent, which is, understandable, maybe admirable in intent, but what are the practical realities?
Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's just like the kulaks, you know. I thought a kulak was a half Chinese, half Jewish guy, but I guess that's not the case.
The kulak is also, by the way, the new ice cream flavor. It's a sort of popsicle thing that I'm going to be launching, and they are delicious. You want to finish those off.
It's straw flavored.
Well, what's going to be your mascot? Because we're going to need the kulak man, and I'm not sure how that's going
The
to work.
cultural Marxist.
Well, it'll be a peasant with bulging pockets because he's engaged in profit, which is obviously theft. So the wealthy peasant. But so yeah, I mean, there were lots of fine social ideas that the communists had, but then those ideas became much more important than practical realities. And then the other problem, and I think it would be interesting to hear Ladon talk about this, since his family is, as far as I know, the only family on this chat that is represented that has had direct experience of a communist system. What ended up then happening? I remember, Ladon, you referenced your mother used to have to steal from her factory, because if you didn't steal from your factory, then your family went without. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It didn't sound like so. Okay, so basically, I've heard stories of communism in Slovakia or Czechoslovakia, and it didn't sound so harsh. Like there wasn't starving. Actually, no. I guess that's untrue. Like my mom was saying that basically they would have chicken once per week, and they would have half the chicken between 5 people, for lunch, and then half for dinner, and that was like all the meat that they had. So, but yeah, like my mom ended up working in a milk factory, and making butter and margarine and all this kind of stuff, cheese, and yeah, I mean everybody was stealing. It was just like an open secret that everybody was stealing, and yeah, if you weren't stealing from the factory, you were stealing from your family, and it was kind of expected that wherever you were working, you kind of got that. I mean, I don't know, like I guess it's kind of the same way now. Like I don't know, if I have a friend from Krispy Kreme, I'm gonna be expecting him to hook me up once in a while, and but this is like a whole nother level. So much, I don't know, I heard some statistics, something like it was like 30% or 40% of like the product went missing. It was just stolen, and I guarantee it's not 40% of Krispy Kreme donuts that go missing, thanks to the employees. But yeah, I don't know, it sounded intense, but I guess she didn't, I don't know, she doesn't talk about it like, oh my god, we were suffering so much. It's kind of like, yeah, that's just the way it was.
Well, it's also, the question is, when was your mother there? Because I don't think she was there during the Stalinist period.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, she was born in 59. So, she, I guess, was working in maybe the 70s and 80s, something like this. So that's kind of the time, maybe the more open time, as you were saying, like, as they realize, like, okay, actually this stuff isn't working, and they kind of go more towards a market economy. So people were, like my mom was, she taught herself to sew, and she made her own jeans and pants and everything like this, because they just didn't have the stuff, so they didn't have jeans. Like they went on a school trip to Moscow, and they took some jeans with them, and like they met like under a staircase, and the babushkas with the shawls, they're just like literally throwing money at them. They're like, they don't even care how much it costs, these jeans. They're just taking it, not even looking at sizes or anything like this. They're just taking it, because Czechoslovakia is more closer to the West, so there was better access to this kind of stuff. I don't know, it's completely crazy stuff. It's really crazy. I mean, I don't know, nowadays I guess we have that with like iPhones and stuff, like people just throwing money, shut up and take my money, and I don't know.
Well, it's a black market. Black markets are true free markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the just to provide a little historical context, like today, when people look back on sort of the glory days of the Soviet Union, it is towards the 70s and the sort of the Brezhnev era, because there weren't the same material shortages, and there weren't the same sort of violent purges that existed under Stalin. But yeah, I mean, I think regardless, things were pretty damn scarce. And it's not just, I mean, the sort of the theft at the factory level that your mom was experiencing, and then there was the theft at the state level, right? The nomenclatura were stealing on even greater levels, and some of those schemes were pretty fascinating. I mean, there was, for example, a huge scandal around Uzbekistan cotton under Brezhnev, where basically they figured out that, they would make up these 5-year plans and set quotas for how much cotton was supposed to be produced. And then they would just falsify the records and say that they delivered more cotton than they had and still get paid by the state for that cotton. And then, of course, that money just goes straight into people's pockets. And not only, and this was the Russian term was propiska, which was basically the falsified records. And the records were falsified so much that there were factories that had been ordered and built that actually never even existed. So the level of corruption was staggering.
Yeah, you guys have heard the joke, right? Like the African, diplomat is going to see his friend, and he's like, how are you so successful? How do you have such a big house? And he shows, he points at a bridge, and he's like, 10%. And the 10 years later, another student comes and asks this original guy, like, oh, how are you so rich? You're even 10 times richer than that first guy. And he points at a field. Do you see that bridge over there? 100%. So I messed up the joke. I don't know, but yeah, it's something along these lines. Like, yeah, it goes straight through to people's pockets, and it's unbelievable how much money is involved. So yeah, and this has always happened though. Like I feel like this has also happened in capitalist structures, and I guess if the level of corruption is not kept in check, then this is free to go rampant, because that's a lot of money. There's a lot of money involved. Like that's millions of dollars into one person's pocket.
And I think the really important point there is that usually these ideologies are used to justify or obscure that theft or that corruption. So a lot of what we hear about capitalism in the West is that, the boogeyman is communism. Well, we don't want communism, and look how bad communism was. And therefore, it's then possible to justify a narrative around what capitalism or the free market actually is. And the problem is I think that, we just have to really start looking at, okay, what are the actual outcomes of the system, regardless of whether we call it, communism, capitalism, socialism. And for example, if you look at the United States today, where a lot of people can't make a living, it doesn't really matter what you call the system. Clearly, it's not working. Yeah.
Yeah. To go along with that, the joke that you referenced, Lidon, is I first heard that one in Francis Fukuyama's Political Order and Decay, when he talks about how do you get to Denmark. And the Chinese official is the one who took 10%, and the African official is the one who took 100%. So I don't know. The question is how do you get a society that works the way you want it to? And that inevitably begs the question, how do you want society to work? And that's the question that Marx was trying to solve. That's the question that Voltaire was trying to solve. That's the question that Thomas Hobbes was trying to solve, trying to find a society that works to keep people safe, to keep people fed, and to not have a ton of war and revolution all the time. And I don't know if we found that answer yet, but we do know that the Soviet system was bad for a lot of people for a long time, and then it got better. And we do know that the Chinese system was bad for a lot of people for a long time, and then it got better. So,
but I think the question is that political philosophers love the idea that you can lay out whatever this system is in a single book. Yeah. And that's why you have to have some clear narrative. But in reality, the system of whatever a society looks like, whether it's for 10,000 people, or whether it's for 500 million people, or whether it's for 7.5 billion people, because whether we like it or not, we're in a global society right now, is going to be far more complex than a single book can capture. And what you really need is the reason why customary practice in tribes of 150 work pretty well internally is because you have the entire community engaged with their intelligence to be able to check things and keep things accountable. And so I think that maybe, to go back to some of what we talked about earlier, We should instead be focused on, pragmatism and whatever works. As Deng Xiaoping said, doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice.
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah, could you say that in Chinese? I would love to learn that in Chinese and just like
Yeah,
randomly quote that.
Hey,
That would sound awesome.
黑毛白毛追老鼠就好。
I'm gonna work on that.
Actually, an extension of what you kind of said, a researcher named Jonathan Hyde said, Hyatt, yeah. He said something along the lines of the way everything started, or how the founding fathers kind of made things out, is apparently they made things just right. So like an educated population, and a certain mindset to have everything kind of started. So let me try to word this right. Sorry about that. So he basically said something along the lines of, think of everything like a well-made clock. You need the pieces inside the clock to function just right for it to tick. And they basically got the people, the people and their temperaments in just the right way, and the incentives just the right way to make people just work it out on their own.
If men were angels, there would be no need for government. Basically, which Federalist is that, Hunter? That's the overarching point, is that
Federalist 51.
Federalist 51. There we go. Yeah, you should. I encourage anybody listening to this to at least peruse the Federalist Papers.
I'm putting it down on Google right now.
Yeah, but like I mentioned before, basically the ideas that were an offshoot of the French Revolution are in many ways tied in with the ideas that were presented in the American Revolution, and ultimately the socialist and communist ideas that came out in the 19th century were an offshoot of those same ideas of, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that there's a reason why that's in the Constitution versus life, liberty, and property. Or it's not in the Constitution, it's in Declaration of Independence. But yeah, so there's these utopian ideals, and in order to have a really pragmatic way of addressing utopia as such is to look at human nature and try and get the best picture of it that you can. And that's one of the drawbacks that came out with communism, is that it's extremely structural. There's no inkling of postmodern thought within the context of communism. Everything's structuralist and a dialectic between the means of production and the people in a society. So everything is based on that, and a Marxist philosopher will make everything fit to that idea, regardless of whether or not it's true. So that's another thing that has to be kept in mind when we're talking about, what communism
postmodern
is.
neo-Marxists.
Yeah.
We need now our metamodern for America.
Oh my God.
So wait, Isaiah, are you
But I
saying
do believe that.
postmodernists are good in this case? That they're more flexible in their thinking, and that's actually what's needed?
We should
And are
have.
you also saying
I
that
think so.
postmodernism? Are you saying that postmodernism and neo-Marxism are inherently contradictory?
They're not contradictory. They're antithetical, which is even stronger way of saying that it makes no sense to group them together at all.
Yep.
Which, and that's the other funny thing about.
If you actually read postmodernist philosophers and you read work by people like Marx, then you compare them. That's pretty much the conclusion you have to come to.
They're oil they're oil and vinegar. Like they don't make any sense to.
Are there books on metamodernism? Like, is there a system actually? I'm curious now. Is there a system that's like kind of based on that yet?
Well, Shia LaBeouf kind of fucked it over, so it's kind of not worth talking
No.
about.
Or did he
anymore.
make it? Did he make it amazing?
Shia LaBeouf.
might-
Oh, actually, just recently heard about that Shia LaBeouf stuff.
They will not replace us. Or oh god, he's
Yeah,
amazing.
but no, I'm saying to look at things kind of in both ways, but acknowledging the sum of their parts, the good and the bad. And recently found that one, so work in progress learning. There's a lot of it, but a lot of them. But
Metamodern needs a little bit more, I guess.
Development?
Yeah, it's
more ironing out.
Yeah,
I would also say, Mark, that the system is known as mixed mental arts. Yeah.
Zing.
That's a point. Fair point indeed.
All right. So, is there any other stuff that we want to cover?
I've got a question. I was just thinking about when Isaiah was talking about the rise of these theories off the back of the feudal economy. I mean, Europe had a feudal economy as well, and I find it interesting that Europe didn't go that route.
What do you mean?
In other words, obviously there was feudalism in Europe, right, in the Middle Ages.
Yes.
Communism was not created in Europe, presumably, although it was coined.
It was.
It was coined by a French philosopher in 1777. I just read, but in other words, communism showed itself and grew out of a feudal economy, where there was another feudal economy that it didn't. I'm just curious why that is.
I don't
Anybody
necessarily.
It's a question. It's not a statement. I'm saying they both had feudal economies, and yet this took hold in Russia.
Russia was Europe. Russia is Europe.
Okay, I'm talking about Northern Europe.
So
I think I mean, you know, whether Russia is Europe or Asia is a pretty long-standing question, and it's sort of always had one foot in both camps.
Right.
But the underlying reasons of culturally why the Russians went for communism and say the Germans didn't, I mean, that's a pretty big question. Certainly the massive income inequality and absolutism of the Tsarist system. There's a tendency towards collectivism, so they were maybe more culturally primed. But I mean, that's a big question.
And the other thought
didn't Hitler also talk about social inequality? I believe.
Well, what came to mind is in Northern Europe, and I should have made that clear. I'm talking about, Western Europe. There was a rise of the middle class, and that eventually took hold, and they got all the power. Right? They weren't snuffed out. So it went from feudalism to limiting the Magna Carta and all, limiting the power of the king and so on.
So
and a rise of the middle class.
What I would say is that these things don't happen in a vacuum, and the greatest war that ever touched humanity was contemporaneous with the Russian revolutions of 1917. So you had a situation in Germany that was actually relatively similar to the situation in Russia. It's just that Germany had a strategic advantage over Russia at the time, and Russia could not stay in the war. And that's the reason why the first revolution, that wasn't the communist revolution, happened, is that they needed to depose the monarch in order to better prosecute the war, essentially. And soon after that, I mean, in Germany, starting in about 1916, you had a de facto military dictatorship where the Kaiser was no longer in control. So it could be said that Germany was on the cusp of a communist revolution in 1917 as 1918 as well. In addition, though, there were a lot of reforms under the government of Otto von Bismarck, like universal healthcare was instituted in Germany during this time, and social safety nets were being instituted all over northwestern Europe, from the middle of the century on, right? So there were a whole bunch of social systems that were tried and removed. In the United Kingdom from around 1850 to 1914. France as well. There were a lot of social safety systems, social safety nets that were being instituted during that time. And in the years after the war, there was, like, Thomas Piketty talks about the collapse of capital in France after the Great War, because they were basically bankrupt, and all the petty bourgeois that had existed were basically out of money because of the tremendous expenditures in both, cash and life that the war caused, and in such that the national wealth devolved into a greater share anyway. And to go along with what you were saying before, like, why did the feudalism devolve into straight Marxist Leninist communism in 1917 in Russia, and it didn't do it in other places? Well, in Western Europe, they had capitalism since the early 19th century, whereas the Tsar was still the autocrat and had complete control over the country
Feudalism
up until 1917.
Right. Yeah, I would argue that in a lot of ways, Europe was a capitalist in a lot of ways, only because of that middle class, the rise of the middle class. They weren't the gentry, they weren't the church.
Yeah, that's what's referred to as the bourgeois in the Marxist literature.
I have a question. For all the countries that ultimately became communist, were there any precursor free market systems in the countries before that transition?
Of the big two, no. Of China and Russia were basically autocratic nations that didn't necessarily have feudal systems in the same way that we think of medieval feudal systems, but it was still an autocratic, landed gentry, et cetera, et cetera. And as far as like Korea is a completely different situation, because you wouldn't have the North Koreans without the help of the Chinese and the Russians. And it's even stranger because Korea up until the 1890s was basically a protectorate of the Imperial Chinese, and after the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese had full influence over Korea, and they actually annexed Korea in 1910. So from 1910 to 1945, Korea was part of Japan. So it's hard to say how communism arose there. Then you have Vietnam, which for at least 1,000 years has had an on again, off again suzerain relationship with Imperial China, and they had resentment against the Chinese until the French came, and from the time that the French came to 1954, when the French left, they were fighting against the French, and then the U.S. came in, and they were just fighting against the U.S. So it was less about communism than it was about Vietnamese identity, anti-colonialism, as it were.
What about Cuba, though?
Cuba is a interesting situation because you could say that they were under a feudal system under the King of Spain up until the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. And then they came under U.S. colonial rule, which it's hard to say. I'm not too spun up on the history of Cuba during that time period, but since the Columbian Exchange began, they functioned as, the same essential caste system as the rest of the Spanish Empire.
Yeah, it seems out there for the big two, they definitely did some influence within their regions. Cuba's, I guess a strange one since we don't have all the history behind it. But I see what you mean with that section of the world, Vietnam, North Korea, and them just want to dispel any people who are occupying them and getting help,
Yeah.
from certain ideologies, would make them, maybe we should try this out.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Certainly.
Yeah.
There's question from the chat room that I looked at. What was it? Let me scroll up. Man, the chat room's been on fire today. It's amazing.
People love and or hate communism.
It's an interesting
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah, it's on extreme fire. I can't see it. There's so many different comments have scrolled by since I looked at it.
Need to institute that super chat. Maybe once we get more than 20 people watching our chats, like maybe if we could get Brian Callen on a chat.
That would be crazy.
Yeah. Anyway,
so I have a communism anecdote. I was in Rome. I guess it was 7 years ago this summer. And the husband of my ex-wife's cousin, there's a mouthful for you, who was a PhD professor of physics, who was a communist. He's the only one I've ever met. And an interesting, smart dude for sure. Took us to an open air kind of fair. There was music and food and so on. And it was communism. It was by the Communist Party of one of them, I guess, or the Communist Party of Italy, and which I was fascinated by. And the only clear recollection I have is that when we sat down to like eat dinner outside at this fair, the menu had things like Gorbachev pasta. Like the entrees were named after Lenin and Gorbachev and
Gorbachev pasta.
I have this picture somewhere still of the menu, and it wasn't a joke. Like, it was just amazing to see that. And he had been to the States, of course, and he spoke good English, but I was like, dude, this is like living in the Matrix. I mean, to an American, to see people actually saying stuff seriously, it's like saying, child molester pasta with beans. I mean, it was so foreign to me. And he's like, yeah, no, I understand. So anyway, and Italy just elected a right-wing government, so they're going the other way on all of that. But anyway, it's fascinating to go to Europe and see that there's legit communist parties. I remember the days when Gus Hall ran for the presidency for a number of elections when I was a kid. He died of old age probably like 20 years ago. But there was an outed communist, a public communist running for the presidency in the States. Doesn't seem to happen anymore.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question, Ed. Which dish did you end up ordering?
I think I did get that. I think it was the Gorbachev, who I actually liked and everybody liked. I don't know if I'm the only one who can really remember when he was head of state. But I get, it's like 7 years ago, so I don't
The
know.
birthmark.
The birthmark, yes.
There's one thing that I always thought that communists did really well, and I don't know if this is just my personal opinion, but I always liked their propaganda art was always awesome.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh, I hear those are
And
actually
their
pretty good,
songs
actually.
too. Their nationalist songs are just like they're very inspiring. It's like "Oh, da, 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 da," and you're just like, whoa, this is really cool.
Well, it's because
Sounds
they're
a lot
always
like-
done they're always in minor key. That's why.
Hmm.
Is it because like a pro-social movements? Like,
Yes. It's a lot like the realist art of the New Deal, and a lot like the marches of goddamn John Paul Sousa in the U.S. Really, really similar.
Well,
I've been
Sousa
wondering-
had always it was like upbeat and like super major key, but the Russian stuff it's always like minor key stuff. Like even
The Chinese
comparing.
stuff is super major key. So
Oh, okay. Because like even like just taking a look at Russian folk music, a lot of it's minor key, like what the Tetris theme.
yeah.
A lot of the music based off the Russian folk music tends to stick in the minor key, and that kind of like all the national anthems and that Russian style of musical propaganda seems to use the Russian folk music as a basis for the types of harmonies and melodies that they put together.
Yeah. Yeah. I, there's so much depth on the individual countries that came out of communism that I don't think we're like that's a research topic in and of itself, just the art of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, exactly. And as Pavox in the Facebook chat, the YouTube chats was saying, every country is different, and every country, like we were talking about communism, like this monolithic thing that spans two continents and dozens of countries, dozens of today's countries, and it was quite different in each place, actually.
Yeah, and there's socialist countries in the West today that aren't necessarily never went through the stage of communism, so it's a hard way to look at things, I think, is to say that communism is right or wrong. It's just a phenomenon that happened. It is a more useful way, I think, of looking at it. And it's a bad way of doing history.
And I thought this was pretty interesting.
I'm sorry to be, it can be looked at, I think where you're going with that is progress of a sense, right? You had top down and then it moved to ground up. So, I mean, I could grant that it, in a sense, was progress, political progress, and so on.
I don't like using the term progress, but I understand where you're going.
Well, I mean,
development, probably evolution.
More to some, at least a move towards some more fairness based on just by head count.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the situation in both China and the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, prior to communism, it
USSR.
It wasn't better under the Tsar than it was under Stalin, and it wasn't better under Mao than it was, or it wasn't better under the emperor than it was under Mao. So, I mean, 20 million people.
I have a question that might, because I know there's like a lot of confusion about like what is a socialist country and what isn't. Like as far as the economy of that specific country, what percentage of it has to be socialized in order for it to be branded as a socialist country?
Well, I think that's up for debate, honestly, because I mean, I've heard France described as a socialist country. And the push and pull in that country is, I don't know, honestly, because a lot of times people say that if you have strong social safety nets and certain aspects of the economy that are basically state trusts or state run, like a public transportation system or a public health system, that you're a socialist country. But it's hard to say whether or not it fits the definition.
Yeah, that's the question I have because of that. And the U.S., 1/6 of the economy is medical, but in somewhere like the UK, it's only 1/10. So if there's definitely different percentages of socialization that can occur within each country. So it's kind of something that's hard to pin down, I think.
Well, that's one of the things that I just read a book called Bullshit Jobs, and there's so many jobs in the UK and the United States that are non-productive, meaning they exist just to exist so that people can have a job. And that's part of the reason why the US maintained the private insurance system, even though they wanted to have an individual mandate with Obamacare instead of instituting a single payer system, because there would be millions of people without jobs.
So does that mean
yeah.
Does that mean something like a universal basic income also would never pass because there's just so many paper pushers that would be out of a job in that case?
I think that's a different thing. If the universal basic income was high enough to where people wouldn't have to work a bullshit job in order to make ends meet, then perhaps it could pass. But there's also the paradigm in especially the United States, especially the East Coast, of the dignity in work, and if you're not working, then you ain't shit paradigm.
So I just want to read off Wikipedia here. There's only 4 countries that are Marxist-Leninists today: China, Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. And the way they define socialist, they break it up in Wikipedia, is current countries with constitutional references to socialism. And that's Bangladesh, Guyana, India, North Korea, Nepal, Portugal, which surprised me, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania.
So self-identification
in their constitution.
Yeah, self-identification essentially. So if a country calls themselves socialist, they are socialist.
How do, because I heard of this book that I haven't read yet called The Economic Hitman, the Journal of an Economic Hitman. How do they kind of factor into people that want to do socialist projects outside of America? So I hear
you should ask Hunter that.
Hunter?
Because you remember Hunter, right?
Oh yes, actually, kinda.
Yeah, you should actually. There's an episode with of a podcast called the Unstructured Podcast. It's our own Eric Hunley, and Hunter was on that. Hunter is the son of an economic hitman, so he would be an interesting resource on that front.
So Unstructured Podcast.
Yeah, I think it's episode 1, right?
Yep, episode 1. But anyway, yeah.
Wait, first let's take a second here. It's a very good podcast and it's edited very well. Who does the editing for that?
I do. Shh! I wasn't trying to plug my own butt here.
Well, we don't want the diarrhea to come out, so you got to make sure to do that.
It's called Unstructured Podcast, right? Or is it a channel?
It's the Unstructured Podcast. Just look it up. It's not on YouTube.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah, look it up on your favorite podcast app, anywhere you shop. But I think we've covered as much communism as we can stomach in this session. So if you guys don't mind, we should wrap it up.
Yeah, agreed. For the next one, actually, for next week's session, I don't know if we've already decided this. Could we talk about the wiki-govern idea that I've been thinking about?
I think next week is black rednecks, white liberals.
Okay. So I want to put that
Okay, that sounds awesome.
on the list. Wiki govern.
All right, we can touch upon that in the next couple weeks. So, I'll let you know. Just let me know when you're available, and we'll see. We can pick out a date for that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Actually, that's a good point because I think next week I'm still good, but the week after that I'm gone for 2 weeks. I'm traveling for 2 weeks, so yeah, it might have to be in July. But yeah, that would be fun. I'd love to get your guys' input and improve this idea too.
What is that wiki govern thing?
Basically, that the legislation, that the rules of a government or country would be open source, so anybody could change it if they want to. They wouldn't have to go through a legislator. They could decide amongst themselves and make the rules.
I have
Okay.
my interest peaked. I will look into it, as Eddie Bravo says.
Sounds like chaos to me.
Anyway,
Chaos, but it could work if it's structured well. I think it could work, and it eliminates corruption. And like corruption is literally impossible in this case, and it speeds things up. Also, like you don't have this like bottleneck of literally going through like 100 people for the entire country that they have to change all the rules and they have to change thousands of topics. So yeah, it has a few advantages, but potentially disadvantages as well.
Yeah, the only disadvantage I see is there are some chaotic Wikipedia articles that have edit wars on them, so that could translate over.
I haven't seen that. I would love if you could send one over.
Yeah, just look at the Gamergate one.
Gamergate.
Anyway,
Yeah.
let's wrap it, Dusty.
All right. Well, since there's a lot of people here and I'm not yet at my desk, we'll go ahead and go through some plugs. So I'll just go by who I have here displayed on the screen. All right, Devendra, did you want to plug anything?
Sure. You can find whatever stuff I'm working on at vanlifewithwoodpecker.com. I got like
All right.
a blog and maybe some future stuff coming up.
All right, great. And LaDon, also known as Bin Laden Jurasek.
Bin Laden. Hello. Yeah. I'm Laden. I have a travel wisdom podcast. I have a neural implant podcast if you're interested in this kind of stuff. And just write me or whatever on the Facebook page as well.
Travel wisdom.
Travel wisdom, yeah. Talking about how travel is more than a vacation, but a learning experience.
I think I saw that podcast once.
Cool.
Cool.
All right. And as for me, I'm just my Twitter is at Mark. What's called Mark the Storm 1 because I'm cheesy, and my Instagram is MarkBen93, and I just kind of post things willy nilly. But as of recently, I've been trying to get into maybe the podcast game or maybe put my thoughts down on YouTube because so it'll be probably at markben93@gmail.com or something along those lines because I'm planning to just put my thoughts out. I listen to a lot of podcasts like this one, and I just kind of tune in and try to learn random shit. Sorry for demonetizing your stuff.
Next. Who's next? Andrew?
Sure. Yeah. If anyone is interested, they can check out my Mindgasms podcast, Mindgasms Andrew Meinzer. You can search it just by looking for Mindgasms on YouTube. And then there's my blog at mindgasms.theblogpress.com. And then I'm on the social medias, the Facebooky Booha and the Twitter on Andrew Meinzer. My last name is spelled Meintzer. And that's pretty much it.
If you couldn't tell from the Z, he's Canadian.
Yeah, eh?
Boots, a boot.
Ed?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm Sam's Bulldog at Edward M. Kennedy 2. Check me out. I mix it up. And I'm also on YouTube as Sam's Bulldog. You can find me there.
Awesome.
I guess I'll go then. I do nothing except for sit in my basement and eat Cheetos. So ignore me. Dustin?
Well, you got a bunch of stuff behind you. What do you do with all that stuff behind you?
I play music every now and then.
What band?
Oh, it's called Great Ghouls in the Soulless. Currently recording a new record.
Where can we find your albums?
Said it here first. Anywhere there's music. Google Play. Look me up on the Googles. Look me up on other things. SoundCloud, Bandcamp, greatghouls.com. I have music.
Awesome.
I got the beats, y'all. Some bangers.
Yes, and you could also hear some of his music in our sister podcasts, such as Unstructured. I know he's featured in the intro, and on occasion you'll hear his music at the beginning of Mixed Mental Arts.
Yeah, I do the intro for that. I'm fancy.
All right, comrades. We have come to a closing. Communism is, I don't know what is communism, but it is
in
glory.
Soviet Russia, communism rules you.
In Soviet Russia, we do things our way. That's it. And fight better sometimes. They come at us.
Yes.
Very snow up here.
I like turtles.
Yes, comrade.
Tell us
Only
about
the
mixed mental
communists.
Our
Yes,
turtles do
so
is
if
the
you'd like
best.
to join us at the Mixed Mental Arts, comrade, we have the Mixed Mental Arts Facebook groupie. You can find that. Ah, fuck this accent. All right, you can find our... Actually, you know what I got to call?
Groupie.
Can you close this out, Isaiah?
Yeah, I'll close this out. So this is another Mixed Mental Arts chat. You can find us on any podcast app at Mixed Mental Arts. It's formerly known as Mixed Mental Arts. Soon it will be known as the Brian Callen Show, but there might still be a Mixed Mental Arts podcast out there. We don't know yet. We're doing it as we can. Join the Facebook group. It's on Facebook. Just search Mixed Mental Arts. Follow the page. Follow us on Twitter, Mixed Mental Arts. Follow us on Instagram, Mixed Mental Arts. Go to our website, Mixed Mental Arts. Put it in the Googles. Everything that we do is called Mixed Mental Arts. Bye. Except for I can't close it out because Dustin has the controls. Good job.
As we awkwardly just sit here
Hold on
and wait for Dusty to close out.
After that really good ending, too.
It was good. It was good.
I'm really good. All right. Hold on. Oh, God damn it, Dustin.
This is what happens when you rely on capitalists.
Yes. I love you guys like I love my eyes. That doesn't make any sense. Do 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 do. I can't turn it off.
Sorry about that. I had to do this some super secret government stuff.
Turn off the chat, Dustin.
All right. Goodbye, comrades. Thank you for joining chat.